No girl was born for this life. Some arrived barefoot, carrying nothing but lice in their hair and bruises on their backs. Others came dressed in stolen silk, still trembling from the betrayal of someone who once called them daughter or wife. The road into the brothel was rarely a single path. It was a web of desperation, deception, and powerlessness, all leading toward a locked door and a life stripped of choice. Poverty was the first gate. Across medieval Europe, in famine years or after plague outbreaks, families disintegrated. Widowed mothers sold daughters to survive a winter. Orphaned girls begged near city walls until someone noticed their youth and made them an offer that wasn't really a question. In southern France, a 1347 notarial record from Toulouse describes a girl given over to the house of women by her aunt in exchange for 2 goats and a winter's worth of firewood. The document survives. The girl's name does not. Some entered by force of contract. In Florence, Genoa, and Avignon, records exist of girls signed into brothels under terms that mimicked apprenticeship, but these were no training guilds. Many were lured in by lies, promised work as laundresses or seamstresses, only to find their first task was to undress before strangers. A register from Venice in 1421 lists a girl sold by her stepfather under the guise of servizio domestico, only to be housed in a brothel the next day. There was no recourse. A male guardian's signature turned her into property. Debt bondage was another trap. In cities like Krakow and Cologne, impoverished women might take out loans from a brothel keeper, often for food, clothing, or shelter. The interest was calculated in bodies. Until the sum was repaid, with no fair way to do so, the woman was bound to serve. Refusing clients only increased the debt. Running away meant arrest. Repayment for most was a fantasy no one believed. Others arrived after being abducted, not always violently, but with cunning. City officials in Prague reported a rise in lost girls in the 1380s, many of whom were later found behind brothel walls registered under new names. In London's Southwark district, testimonies from the late 14th century describe girls taken from inns or markets and sold across the river with the help of corrupt port guards. No one searched for them, not the sheriffs, not the church, and certainly not the men who lined up at the brothel door. Even those who entered through family coercion were often framed as willing. Fathers, stepbrothers, and uncles could justify the transaction by claiming necessity or repentance. And for women born to prostitutes, the brothel was not an entrance at all. It was home. In cities like Avignon, daughters of sex workers were statistically more likely to end up in brothels themselves, forming generational lines of coerced labor within the same walls. These were not isolated tragedies. They were structured recruitments, repeated across regions and decades. Cities turned away because the system worked. It supplied bodies without openly breaking laws. Women disappeared from fields, workshops, or plague-swept alleys and reappeared as names in municipal tax books or weekly inspection rolls. What happened in between was nobody's business, because once a woman entered the brothel, she ceased to matter as a person. Only her function remained. Her body was inspected weekly by a city surgeon, taxed monthly by officials, and abused daily by men who never spoke her name. In Nuremberg or London, the brothel was a business, and the woman inside was just another ledger entry. In medieval society, she occupied one of the lowest rungs imaginable. And yet, paradoxically, she was also essential. She was neither outlaw nor citizen, neither criminal nor worker. While the church condemned her as a living emblem of sin, local governments quietly legalized and regulated her presence, accepting her suffering as the price of preserving public order. This was not hypocrisy. It was structure. In city after city across Europe, from Paris to Prague, from Siena to Southwark, prostitutes were tolerated not out of mercy, but out of civic pragmatism. Their labor was seen as necessary to preserve male virtue by giving it an outlet. Their degradation was framed as protective of wives, daughters, and the wider moral fabric. Canon law proclaimed prostitution a mortal stain on the soul, likening it to spiritual rot. Yet papal cities like Avignon oversaw municipal brothels, and bishops in wealthy dioceses drew revenue from taxed sex work. Preachers thundered against lust from the pulpit, while their own cities maintained red light districts in shadowed corners just beyond the parish line. The woman herself was both needed and reviled. If she stood outside a church, she risked being stoned. If she approached the marketplace dressed in the wrong color, she could be flogged. But if she remained in the brothel, under the eye of a bailiff or madam, she was permitted, because that was where society had chosen to bury its contradictions. In legal charters, she was marked off with euphemisms: public woman, servant of the town, or licensed girl. These titles served to both acknowledge and erase her. In many cities, she was legally forbidden from wearing pearls, fur, or belts with gilded buckles. In others, she had to cover her head with distinctive veils or wear striped garments that distinguished her from honest women. These were not merely fashion rules. They were spatial and symbolic boundaries. The prostitute was made visible to be kept invisible, clearly marked so that she could be avoided, blamed, and surveilled without being acknowledged as fully human. Even in law, her rights were blurred. She could be fined for refusing a client, jailed for speaking against a madam, or expelled for being too old to bring in money. If she were assaulted, authorities might record the incident, not as a crime against her, but as a disturbance to the brothel's income. She was a body measured in coins and contracts, and beyond that, the law had no language for her suffering. And yet, despite the cruelty of her place in the hierarchy, she was rarely alone. Thousands of women across Europe lived within these same invisible boundaries, scattered through back alleys, city gates, and slope districts that no map marked clearly. They shared a fate, even if they never shared a name. The system that kept them there was not a secret. It was inscribed in tax records, city ordinances, and sermons. What was absent was empathy. That medieval society refused to write down. The brothel was a building of rules, silence, and decay. Its doors were heavy, often reinforced from the inside, not to keep the clients out, but to keep the women in. Inside, rooms were narrow and bare, their walls stained by smoke and breath, their air thick with sweat, disease, and the trace of old weeping. A bed, a stool, and a chamber pot might be all a woman had to call her own. In some houses, the straw mattress was shared in shifts. The smell of mold and cheap ale clung to the stones. Brothels varied in scale, from small, dim townhouses to multi-roomed, city-run establishments, sometimes called stews in England or Frauenhäuser in German cities. In Avignon and Nuremberg, municipal records describe buildings divided into sections: private cells for the women, communal washing areas, kitchens with coarse bread and wine, and a central room where men waited, laughed, and gambled while women were called in like servants. Privacy did not exist. Walls were thin, doors rarely locked, and no conversation stayed secret. The day began before light. Some women cleaned, some nursed each other's sores. If a woman was bleeding or bruised too visibly, she might be barred from receiving clients until her appearance recovered, not out of concern, but to protect the brothel's reputation. Municipal regulations in cities like Zurich and Lübeck mandated that every prostitute be inspected weekly by a physician or barber surgeon. They checked for visible signs of disease, ulcers, rashes, discharges, not to treat them, but to separate the unclean from the marketable. Those found infected were fined or thrown out. Many returned untreated with a false name. Health was a performance, so was submission. The women were expected to smile, flirt, and remain pliant. And if they resisted, punishments were swift. Brothel owners, often former prostitutes themselves or male guardians appointed by the city, wielded near-total control. They set quotas, arranged client schedules, withheld food, and enforced silence. A woman who refused to work could be locked in the cellar. In Paris, one house kept a heavy chair bolted to the floor, where disobedient girls were tied and starved until they learned their duty. Economic exploitation was relentless. Nearly every coin paid by a client went elsewhere. The madam took her cut, the city took taxes, the physician, guards, laundrywoman, and cook all received payment before the prostitute touched a single coin. Many women worked 6 or 7 days a week and still ended the month in debt. To eat, they often borrowed from the madam's pantry. To clothe themselves, they bought on credit from merchants approved by the house. The deeper the debt, the longer they stayed. Freedom became a theoretical horizon, something always out of reach, just beyond the ledger's edge. Physical and sexual abuse were constant. Consent was never part of the transaction. A woman could be beaten if she refused a man, but rarely found justice if she was injured by one. In Genoa and Cologne, city court records show dozens of cases of excessive violence committed by clients, but very few led to punishment. The woman was seen as damaged goods, not a person wronged. If she tried to report the abuse, she risked being dismissed for insubordination or labeled mad. Some women carved out small rituals of survival. They hid coins under floorboards, tended wounds with herbs brought by sympathetic laundresses. They whispered stories of escape into the night, even when they knew no one was coming. They helped each other endure, because no one else would. To live in the brothel was to be held in a machine built for extraction. The women inside were reduced to their usefulness, their voice drowned in the weight of every rule, every inspection, every lie that claimed they were there by choice. The brothel was not an accident. It was a municipal institution, structured, taxed, and counted like a market or a mill. City councils, far from trying to eradicate prostitution, often crafted detailed policies to manage it. In places like London's Southwark, Nuremberg's Frauenhaus, Avignon's Rue du Puy, or Cracov's designated public houses, local governments regulated every corner of brothel life, from the architecture of the building to the days women could work, the clothing they were allowed to wear, and the exact fines imposed for disobedience. Sex was not just sold, it was administered. These women were not citizens, but their bodies were civic property. In many cities, they were forbidden from working outside designated zones. In London, this meant Southwark, just beyond the jurisdiction of the city proper, across the Thames. In Florence, it was the Via Fiessolana. In Genoa, the winding streets below the city's arches. These districts were tolerated, not hidden. Their existence served a purpose: to contain sin while preserving the illusion of public virtue elsewhere. Municipal authorities profited directly. In Avignon, then a papal seat, brothels were sometimes owned outright by the city or leased to private operators who paid annual fees. City treasuries recorded the earnings, itemized by headcount and season. Winter brought leaner months. Easter often saw a surge. These records, precise and dry, reveal the bureaucratic indifference behind human suffering. A woman might be sick, beaten, or barely conscious, but as long as she could generate revenue, the city remained silent. Madams and brothel owners acted as middle agents between the city and the women. They managed accounts, enforced regulations, and answered to officials. In some places, they were required to post bonds, financial guarantees that the brothel would remain orderly and compliant. If a scandal broke out, or if the women became too unruly, the madam lost her bond, and the building might be shuttered temporarily, not for moral reasons, but to protect the city's reputation. In 1380s Nuremberg, such closures were rare. The city preferred stability over justice. Fees were layered and punishing. Women paid rent for their rooms, taxes on their earnings, and fees for physicians, inspectors, guards, and candles. In many cases, they even had to pay to have their names listed on the daily client roll, the medieval equivalent of advertising. Cities imposed curfews and fines for being seen outside the brothel after dark or dressed in unapproved colors. The rules shifted constantly, designed less to maintain order than to ensure that women never achieved financial independence. Municipal involvement extended beyond money. In some cities, women were required to attend civic rituals. In Krakow and Cologne, records mention forced attendance at sermons aimed at repentance. In Southwark, women could be summoned to testify in court cases, often without protection or pay, used as informants or scapegoats. The same system that denied them dignity also exploited their visibility when it served the law. It is tempting to believe this bureaucratic machinery was a failure of morality. But in truth, it functioned precisely as designed. By institutionalizing brothels, cities created a controlled outlet for male sexuality, drew income from female degradation, and avoided the unpredictability of underground prostitution. It was not reform. It was management. For the women inside, this translated into a life of relentless monitoring. Every act was recorded, not to protect them, but to ensure the flow of coin never ceased. Their labor fed the city's coffers, and their silence preserved its respectability. The church thundered against sin, and yet stood shoulder to shoulder with it. In every cathedral town where prostitutes were denounced from the pulpit, a bishop or monk likely passed them in silence on his way to morning prayer. In sermons, they were cast as daughters of Eve, agents of corruption sent to tempt men from the path of righteousness. But in practice, they were woven into the fabric of Christian cities, not with acceptance, but with a calculated tolerance, cloaked in doctrine and laced with hypocrisy. Prostitution was officially condemned by canon law. Church councils repeatedly declared it immoral, shameful, and damning. And yet, across medieval Europe, the very same church sanctioned cities that institutionalized brothels. In Avignon, during its time as the papal capital, brothels were not only legal, but profitable. Tax records from the early 14th century show brothels paying fees directly to the church's treasury, under agreements that preserved public order in exchange for coin. The contradiction was not hidden, it was rationalized. Influential theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, argued that prostitution was a necessary evil. Like sewers beneath a house, they said, brothels carried away moral filth and preserved the cleanliness of society above. Without them, it was feared, men would prey on virgins, wives, or nuns. In this grim logic, the suffering of a few women was a price worth paying to safeguard the greater virtue of others. Clergy themselves were rarely innocent. Records from London and Lyon, from Ghent to Granada, document priests, monks, and even abbots caught visiting brothels. Some were quietly disciplined, others faced no consequence at all. In 13th century Paris, Bishop Odo was publicly rebuked for sheltering women known to have worked in brothels, not to reform them, but to enjoy their company. Confession and absolution were always available to male transgressors. For women, there was only penance or punishment. Some religious orders did attempt to help. Beguines and Magdalene houses offered refuge to women who sought to leave sex work behind. In Rome, Florence, and Krakow, small convents accepted former prostitutes, though often under harsh conditions. Entry required public repentance, strict cloistering, and permanent celibacy. A woman had to prove her remorse, not only through prayer, but through obedience, poverty, and the erasure of her former identity. These institutions saved some lives, but they saved them conditionally. One wrong step, one failure to comply, and the door could close forever. The church's public image required visible repentance. Processions of fallen women in sackcloth, bare feet bleeding on city stones, were paraded through town squares. These rituals reinforced the spectacle of shame while allowing the church to perform mercy. For the women, it was humiliation disguised as redemption. More quietly, other women turned to religious symbols as shields. In Krakow, some wore makeshift rosaries under their skirts. In London, a prostitute once hid a small cross in her bodice, believing it might protect her from disease or violence. The church taught her she was damned, but she still reached for grace in the only way she could. In the end, the institution that preached purity found a way to live beside filth. It condemned women's bodies while profiting from their ruin. It demanded piety while ignoring the system that made repentance nearly impossible. And in doing so, it helped sustain a world where sin was not destroyed, but carefully organized. And always female. She could be recognized from across the street. Even in a crowd, her sleeves might be dyed yellow in Avignon, her veil striped in Vienna, her belt made of rope in London, crude symbols worn not by choice, but by ordinance. The clothes did not protect her. They marked her. The medieval prostitute was not just separated by profession. She was branded in fabric and space, made visible in order to be excluded. Sumptuary laws made this exclusion explicit. Across Europe, from Siena to Strasbourg, city councils dictated the garments prostitutes were allowed to wear. Dull colors, coarse fabrics, no embroidery, no fur, no jewelry save iron or base metal. In Florence, a 1384 decree required all public women to wear a narrow red ribbon on their shoulder. In Augsburg, the ban extended to shoes. They could not wear pointed toes or shoes higher than one finger's width. These rules were about more than appearance. They declared that such women did not belong among the decent, the virtuous, the seen. Even in language, their humanity was peeled away. They were not women, but creatures, wenches, or whores. In German town ordinances, they appear as gemeine Dirnen, common harlots, stripped of individuality. In Latin legal texts, the word meretrix often appears without a name, a generic shadow in court records and tax rolls. City scribes wrote these women into existence only long enough to fine, relocate, or forget them. Spatial segregation reinforced the symbolic one. Brothels were often built along rivers, outside walls, or just beyond city gates, places where the clean and unclean met. In London, Southwark stood across the Thames, beneath the gaze of the Bishop of Winchester, yet outside the city's legal reach. In Krakow, prostitutes were confined to the Pijarska or Świętojerska districts, forbidden to enter marketplaces or churches. Some cities enforced physical distance. Prostitutes were ordered to cross the street if an honorable woman approached. To remain standing was defiance. To make eye contact was an offense. This exclusion extended even in death. Many were buried without rites in unconsecrated ground outside the town walls. Their graves were unmarked. Their names, if ever recorded, were forgotten. The church warned that their souls were lost unless they repented. But even if they did, no one carved their story into stone. A prostitute who died unnamed was the system's final victory. Silence buried under dirt. Associations with other marginalized groups deepened their isolation. In times of religious hysteria or plague, prostitutes were linked with Jews, lepers, or heretics, cast as corruptors, infectors, witches. In Basel during the Black Death, prostitutes were accused of spreading poison, a rumor that cost dozens their lives. In some cities, sex workers were ordered to remain indoors on holy days, lest their presence taint the streets where saints were honored. They became scapegoats not just for lust, but for death, disease, and divine wrath. Despite the public scorn, the demand for their labor never ceased. Men who insulted them in daylight returned in darkness. City guards who fined them for stepping outside the brothel later escorted them to private quarters. The exclusion was never total, only performative. Society needed these women but refused to accept them, so it turned them into symbols of sin, of shame, of the limits of female power. They were reminders of what happened when a woman lived outside obedience, even if she was forced there. And yet, amid the dehumanization, many found small ways to reclaim identity. Some sewed their names in secret onto the hems of their skirts. Others kept lockets, tokens, or saints' medals hidden under mattresses. These were not acts of defiance, but of preservation, proof that beneath the veil and the bruises, someone still lived, still remembered her name, even when the world refused to say it aloud. Some did try to run. Under the cover of night, with stolen cloaks or bare feet, they slipped through alleys and stables, hoping the gate guard had fallen asleep, or the madam had not yet counted the beds. They ran not toward safety, but toward the unknown, because even the threat of hunger, prison, or death seemed less cruel than one more night in the brothel. Escape was not common, but it was constant. In city records, the traces remain. Cold, bureaucratic notations of women missing from the roll, fled from the house, absented without license. In Nuremberg, a ledger from 1412 lists a woman named Magdalena who vanished after her third inspection. The owner filed a complaint. The city sent a patrol, but there is no record she was ever found. Her name ends there, on a line scratched in faded ink, her silence more powerful than anything the court could have punished. Some women did not flee alone. They planned their escapes together, pooling what little they had, coins hidden in sewing kits, bread smuggled from the kitchen, favors traded with stable boys or city guards. In Krakow, a group of 5 prostitutes escaped a municipal brothel in 1389 and sought refuge in a Dominican monastery. The monks, bound by their own vows, hid them for several weeks before surrendering them to the city. They were returned, beaten and fined. But their brief flight was remembered in later chronicles, not as a crime, but as a scandal. The women were never named. The church offered a narrow path to escape, cloistered repentance. But the gate to the convent was guarded by rules. A woman seeking entry to a Magdalene house had to confess publicly, give up any earnings, and commit to a life of silence and servitude. Many were refused. They were too young, too ill, or not sufficiently penitent. Others were admitted, only to be broken by the harsh conditions. In Rouen, a former prostitute named Isabel took vows in 1394, only to hang herself in the convent garden a year later. Her death was recorded in silence. The abbess wrote only, "She succumbed to old temptations." Still, not all resistance was flight. Some women resisted by enduring. They carved small freedoms from within the brothel itself. They faked illness to avoid work, bribed officials to adjust their debt records, or pretended to be pregnant to delay clients. Some took lovers, real or strategic, who might offer protection, or at least fewer bruises. Others became madams themselves, climbing the ladder of exploitation not to escape it, but to soften its cruelty for those who came after. There were also those who tried to speak. In 15th century Bologna, a woman named Lucia petitioned the city to release her from bonded service, citing abuse by the brothel's owner. Her request was denied. But the petition survives, rare testimony in a world where women like her were not meant to leave a record. Her words, though copied by a clerk, still carry breath. "I am kept like cattle. I am beaten, and no coin is mine." It is not a cry for mercy. It is a record of truth. For many, there was no escape. Some vanished into illness, consumed by syphilis, dysentery, or fever. Others took their own lives, leaping from balconies or drinking lye. City officials sometimes noted these deaths, briefly, mechanically, and replaced the women with others, brought in through the same systems of poverty and coercion. But each attempt to flee, to hide, to speak, even to survive, was resistance. These were not passive victims. They were active in their pain, intelligent in their concealment, and fierce in their efforts to reclaim even a scrap of dignity. For over 4 centuries, the women who lived and died inside Europe's brothels were treated not as individuals, but as moving parts in a system too structured, too useful, and too profitable to dismantle. Their voices were lost beneath layers of official documents that recorded them only as taxable bodies, sources of income, or moral problems to be managed, never as full human beings with histories, thoughts, or names worth preserving. And yet, despite the silence imposed upon them, the outline of their existence bleeds through the seams of medieval bureaucracy, carved faintly into ledgers, ordinances, and punishments like scars on vellum. These women did not disappear by chance. Their erasure was intentional, built into the very architecture of medieval urban life, which depended on regulating sexuality without confronting its cost. Brothels were designed not to hide sin, but to contain it, positioned on the edge of legal, moral, and geographic boundaries so that society could look away while still reaping the benefits. Municipal authorities collected taxes from their exploitation, physicians profited from their inspections, clerks noted their earnings in public ledgers. Even when their suffering was visible, it was processed administratively, reduced to data points that made the machine run smoother. Prostitution was not viewed as an aberration of order. It was part of the order itself. These women were the tolerated exceptions that made the illusion of public virtue sustainable. Their existence allowed respectable society to define itself in contrast, to draw boundaries between purity and filth, obedience and deviance, citizen and outcast. And yet the lines were never as clear as cities pretended. Many of the men who punished them during the day returned to them at night. The same authorities who outlawed their presence in markets and churches created laws to protect the revenue they generated. Beneath the sermons and statutes lay a quiet but relentless hypocrisy. They did not merely suffer in isolation, they labored in silence, caught between the needs of urban economics and the pretensions of religious morality. Most worked under constant surveillance, bound by debt, fear, or physical force, and their chances of escape were vanishingly small. But even so, traces of resistance remain. Some fled, some concealed small treasures or carved prayers into their furniture, some left behind petitions, letters, or testimonies that survived by chance, brittle evidence that they had tried, even once, to name their pain. Modern historians now piece together their stories from fragments left behind not by compassion, but by administration. The same officials who taxed and punished these women unwittingly preserved details of their lives. Lists of fines, contracts of sale, health inspections, and city court records that now serve as the only surviving testimony to who they were. These dry, mechanical sources offer glimpses, sometimes just a line, a name, a description of bruises, into a human world that the Middle Ages refused to honor but could not completely erase. They were not simply victims of their time, nor passive elements within a cruel system. Many endured for years under conditions that broke others within weeks. They survived by sharing what little they had, by trusting each other when no one else could be trusted, and by reclaiming pieces of themselves through rituals too small for official notice, a prayer, a song, a thread tucked inside a hem. Their lives were reduced to ledger entries, but what they carried within them was more than coin or shame. It was the raw, persistent force of survival in a world that considered them disposable. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.